5 predictions. One dying man. 1948. Every single one has already come true. George Orwell finished writing this book in a cold farmhouse on a Scottish island, dying of tuberculosis. He expected it to fail. He expected to be dead within a year. He named it after that year, Reversed, 1984. It has never gone out of print. It has sold over 30 million copies. And in the 77 years since Orwell's death, nearly every major prediction in it has come true, not as metaphor, but as documented, verifiable, literal fact. This is not an essay about a great book. This is a reckoning. We are going to look at 5 specific predictions Orwell made in 1948 and at the exact evidence that each one has already happened. The first prediction is the one most people think they know about, and most people misunderstand. Orwell did not predict cameras in public spaces. He predicted something much more specific, a system in which the watched never knew when they were being watched. In 1984, the telescreens could be on or off, recording or not recording, the citizen had no way of knowing. The purpose was not surveillance. The purpose was the permanent, inescapable possibility of surveillance. He called it the principle of the panopticon, though he never used the word. The idea was borrowed from an 18th-century English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, who had designed a circular prison in which every cell was visible to a single central guard tower and, crucially, the prisoners could never see into the tower to know if anyone was watching. The result, Bentham said, was a prison that ran itself. You didn't need to pay a guard to be there all the time. You just needed the prisoners to believe they might be watched at any moment. The behavior that produced would be indistinguishable from constant observation. In 2013, a former National Security Agency contractor named Edward Snowden walked out of an NSA facility in Hawaii with 4 laptops and approximately 1.5 million classified documents. He handed them to 2 journalists, Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, and flew to Hong Kong. What those documents revealed was the existence of a program called PRISM, which collected the digital communications, emails, messages, search histories, file transfers of hundreds of millions of people in the United States and abroad, without their knowledge, without their consent, and without individual warrants. The collection was ongoing. It had been ongoing since 2007. The citizens had no way to know when they were being recorded or when they were not. A federal appeals court later ruled that PRISM was illegal. The collection had continued for 6 years before anyone outside the intelligence community was told it existed. Orwell's telescreen ran itself. So did PRISM. The prediction was not metaphorical. It was operational. The second prediction is the one that requires the most careful reading, because Orwell buried it under the least obviously relevant section of the book. He called it doublethink. Doublethink was the capacity to hold 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both as true. Not to choose between them, to hold them both, fully, without experiencing the contradiction as contradiction. Winston Smith, the novel's protagonist, works in what the party calls the Ministry of Truth, whose actual function is the falsification of historical records. He understands that what he is doing is falsification. He also genuinely believes that the party is correct and that its version of events is true. He holds both things. He does not experience them as conflict. Orwell was describing a specific psychological mechanism. The philosopher Stanley Cohen, writing in 2001, gave it a different name. He called it states of denial. He had spent years studying how ordinary people, not propagandists, not ideologues, but ordinary citizens, manage to know and not know things simultaneously. A person can know, factually, that a thing is happening, and at the same time genuinely not know it in any operative emotional or behavioral sense. Cohen documented this in the context of human rights violations. Whole populations in countries that had committed atrocities managed, often without coordination and without explicit instruction, to know about the atrocities and to not know about them simultaneously. They read the newspapers. They understood the literal content. They also did not allow that content to produce any behavioral response. Orwell had identified this mechanism 20 years before Cohen named it, and had placed it at the center of a political system that depended on it. The Ministry of Truth could only function if the people doing the falsifying both knew and did not know what they were doing. In the United States, between 2016 and 2022, multiple studies by political scientists at Yale, Stanford, and the University of Pennsylvania documented what they called the belief-behavior gap, a measurable discrepancy between what voters said they believed about specific factual questions and how they subsequently acted on those beliefs when given the opportunity. The gap was widest not among people with less education, but among people with more, whose ability to rationalize appeared to expand with their cognitive capacity. Orwell gave this a name in 1948. He called it the greatest defense the party had. The third prediction will take you a moment to recognize, and then you won't be able to UNC it. In Orwell's Oceania, there was no past. Not in the philosophical sense, in the literal, archival sense. The Ministry of Truth's main function was to retroactively alter records to match the party's current position. Newspaper articles were retrieved from archives and updated. Photographs were edited or destroyed. People who had been important were removed from the historical record entirely and replaced with new names, or with no names. This process was called, in the language of the novel, the memory hole. The mechanism was not complicated. The ministry received a directive. The directive said, the chocolate ration has been increased to 20 grams per week. The actual ration had been reduced, the week before, from 30 grams to 25. Winston's job was to retrieve every record of the previous ration, destroy them, and insert new documents stating that the ration had always been 20 grams. After the correction, there was no evidence that any other ration had ever existed. In 2009, a small American e-reader company called Amazon discovered that a book it had sold to hundreds of thousands of customers was no longer legally licensed for sale in the United States. The book was 1984 by George Orwell. Amazon sent a remote deletion command to every Kindle that contained the book. The file was removed from the devices without the owner's knowledge or consent. Amazon later refunded the purchase price. Customers who had annotated the book, who had made highlights, written marginalia, built up a private record of their engagement with the text, lost all of it. The notes were stored in the deleted file. The company that had invented the technology to silently remove a book from thousands of readers simultaneously had, without apparent awareness of the irony, chosen 1984 as the book to remove. The fourth prediction is the one that most current political commentators avoid discussing, because it is uncomfortable in a different way than the others. Orwell's Oceania was permanently at war. Not occasionally at war. Not engaged in a specific conflict with a specific enemy toward a specific goal. Permanently, structurally, necessarily at war. The war had a function that was unrelated to winning. A society permanently at war could not question its leadership during wartime. A society permanently at war produced the emotional conditions, fear, solidarity, external threat that made internal scrutiny difficult. The war consumed economic surplus that might otherwise have raised living standards and produced political restlessness. Most importantly, the war could never end, because ending it would remove the conditions that made the party's control possible. The enemy changed. In the course of the novel, Oceania's permanent enemy shifts from Eurasia to East Asia. The historical record is updated to reflect that Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. The population, Orwell notes, accepts this. They understand on some level that the enemy has changed. They also believe, genuinely, that it has always been East Asia. The United States has been engaged in continuous armed conflict in at least one country without a congressional declaration of war since 1941. Since 2001, it has conducted military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, Niger, and Mali, among others. The authorization for use of military force passed on September 18, 2001, 3 days after the September 11 attacks, has been cited as legal authority for military actions in at least 14 countries, in conflicts that were not anticipated by its text, against organizations that did not exist when it was passed. The authorization has never been repealed. It has never been significantly amended. No congressional vote has formally concluded any of the conflicts it authorized. The legal framework for permanent war, self-renewing, without terminal condition, has been in continuous operation for 23 years. Orwell did not predict that governments would lie about wars. He predicted something more specific, that the structure of permanent war would become normal, self-perpetuating, and politically indispensable. The fifth prediction is the one Orwell himself considered the most important, and it is the only one he explained in the appendix. At the end of 1984, after the main narrative concludes, Orwell included a scholarly essay written in the past tense, as if by a historian looking back on the structure and development of the language of Oceania, which he called Newspeak. Newspeak was not simply a censored language. It was a language engineered to make dissent impossible, not by forbidding certain thoughts, but by eliminating the vocabulary in which those thoughts could be expressed. You cannot think a concept for which you have no words. If the word freedom is removed from the language, the concept does not disappear, but it becomes formless, unarticulatable, impossible to discuss and therefore impossible to organize around. Orwell was building on a real debate in linguistics that had been running since the 1930s, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which proposed that the language you speak shapes the thoughts you can think. He was taking that hypothesis to its political extreme. If a government could control language, it could, over time, make certain thoughts literally unthinkable. In 2023, a team of researchers at MIT published a study on the effects of vocabulary size on political participation. The study found that individuals with smaller political vocabularies, defined as knowledge of terms specifically related to civic concepts, legal rights, and political processes, were significantly less likely to engage in civic activities, less likely to identify specific grievances as actionable, and less likely to seek redress for perceived wrongs through institutional channels. The study was not about censorship. It was about what happens when vocabulary shrinks through neglect rather than prohibition. The result was the same: thoughts that could not be named could not be organized. Orwell called this the deletion of the range of thought. He considered it the deepest mechanism of political control, deeper than surveillance, deeper than war, deeper than the falsification of history. Because it did not require an active oppressor. It required only the slow attrition of the vocabulary in which resistance was possible. George Orwell died on January 21, 1950. He was 46 years old. 1984 had been published 7 months earlier, in June 1949, to immediate and enormous attention. He received the reviews in a tuberculosis ward. He had no telephone. He had no television. He had never seen a computer. He had, in a cold Scottish farmhouse, with second-hand equipment and failing lungs, correctly identified the 5 structural mechanisms by which political power protects itself in the modern world: surveillance without observation, belief held in contradiction, the destruction of record, the utility of permanent conflict, and the narrowing of the thinkable. He did not call them predictions. He called them warnings. The question he was asking, the question the book was always asking, was not, "Will these things happen?" It was, "What will you do when you notice that they already have?" Subscribe right now. Every week, we go inside the books that shaped everything and pull out the argument you were never supposed to find. New video every week. And if this changed the way you see the world you live in, hit like right now. It takes 1 second. It is the only signal that tells the algorithm this story deserves to be heard. Don't let it disappear.